Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. Ben McCormick here with Clinton Weaver for the Duke Carolina Preview. And this is a especially interesting one for the Duke Wisdom Podcast specifically because Clinton and I have very complicated relationships with both schools. Students at Carolina, sometimes student at Duke, or just been around Duke, family ties to each institution. You name it. We've got some crazy ties going on, and so our perspective on this rivalry and on these two schools, I think, is especially interesting to hear, to say the least. And so, I think the way that we want to start this basically is talking about what our relationship with each of these institutions is now, and what it has been kind of throughout our life and how that's evolved. So we'll start with Carolina because this issue is going to be, or this episode is going to be talking a lot about the Tar Heels. Um, of course, it is Tar Heel Hate Week, but it's been difficult, I think, to hate Carolina my entire life. Um, Grew up a massive Duke fan my entire life, right? People would joke about, they were like, what if you got like a Division I basketball offer to go to Carolina? Would you? Like, that's how much I hated Carolina growing up. People would have to ask me that question, and as like a 10-year-old, I would actually consider it, like as if that was an actual thing you would consider. Like, of course you would do that, but I never in a million years would have envisioned myself going to Carolina. Throughout the college decision, there were a lot of things at play for me. My brother went to Carolina, a 2020 graduate of UNC, and he's actually a lifelong Carolina fan, so there's no shocker there. No two forces working on him. He's just all Tar Heel all day. Works at the university now, actually. But for me, I applied to like 6 schools. I got into all but one, and the one I didn't get into was Duke. And that's something I don't talk about a lot, but that is the one school I didn't get into. Now, in retrospect, I think it may have worked out for the best for me given what I've decided to go into professionally, because at the end of the day, you can't get much better than Carolina for sports journalism. Some people might not want to hear that, but it's true. And so for me, going through the college decision, there were schools that maybe were more elite than Carolina that I got into. But I was making a college decision during COVID. And so that was really weird. And with my brother having just graduated, or he was about to graduate when I made the decision from Carolina, I had been around the university. I knew the university. I had a handful of friends going to Carolina. I knew the area, and it was close to home when some of those other schools weren't quite as close. And so for me, I probably didn't think I was going to Carolina until the day I had to make the decision. I made the decision, and here I am today, now a UNC graduate, hosting this Duke podcast. and it's so weird, and it's one of the weirder things that people figure out about me. But for me, I think my relationship with Carolina has changed because I'm immensely proud to have graduated from that school. I look at that degree with a great sense of pride, even though it does say, University of North Carolina. And it became harder as I covered sports at the Daily Tar Heel. I wrote for the DTH for a couple of years on the sports desk, and it became harder and harder to look at these athletes like the villains that you build them up to be in your head as a Duke basketball fan. So especially for like the Olympic sports, like they were just cool. They were just people I knew, and I enjoyed covering them and talking to them. And the basketball team didn't grow on me quite as much. The players I didn't have any problems with, and that's kind of how I am now when I look at the Hubert Davis, or when I look at these players out there on the floor, I'm not like, I can't stand that guy, because it's like, I know that guy. Like, I don't have hate in my heart for anybody on the team right now at Carolina. And that was not the case when I was 12, 13 years old. Like, I hated those dudes that put on baby blue. But now it's just like, yeah, like, I hope you don't win this game because I have rooting interest in the opposite direction. but I don't really hate them. And so I think that's complicated my relationship with this rivalry. It's not like I want Duke to win any less. I absolutely, that's still very much present. But I think I'm more fueled by a desire to see Duke win than to just see Carolina lose. And I don't know, having so many ties in at the university, I don't love the basketball program anymore, but I hate a little less. I think that's the key difference for me.
Well, that's a step in the right direction. So congratulations on moving along that path towards reconciliation.
That's right. That's right.
A few more years of therapy, and I'm sure you'll get there. So, my story is somewhat similar. Duke fan my whole life. My mother, father, brother, sister, all Dukies. So I grew up going to the games. I grew up with hate in my heart for the baby blues of UNC. And when it came time to apply for college, I applied to 3, Duke, UNC, and Virginia. I got into all 3 and went to Duke. Didn't stay very long, got my grades, and that was sort of a hint that maybe I should get out of there before they kicked me out. So I ended up at Carolina, of all places, and that's where I graduated from also. I had to keep a low profile in college because of that, because I was still a Duke fan. I was there during the Michael Jordan era, so I was on Franklin Street when the big celebration happened, because where else was I going to be, But it's not like I was all giddy happy that UNC had just won the national championship. So the way I sort of reconciled myself was academically versus athletically. So academically, UNC is great, had a great time there, got a degree in what I should have been studying all along, which was journalism. And but I drew a sharp dividing line between academics and athletics. I didn't go to any basketball games, even during the Michael Jordan era. Why would I? Because it was Carolina, I'm not going to go see those guys. So I've maintained that dividing line, and even today I'm teaching classes over at Carolina, and somehow living with the schizophrenia of being a Duke fan who's employed by their arch rival, and so somehow it works, and I'm able to live with myself and still have the hatred in my heart for UNC that belongs there.
I think that, the separation of athletics and academics is definitely something that was key. It became really difficult for me to do that because of just how frequently I had to cover the sports teams for my classes and stuff like that. So that became a little bit difficult to separate them. But like you said, I only went to one Carolina sporting event that I wasn't covering, that I wasn't there on a journalistic capacity for, and that was Duke Carolina football, like in 2021. And I wore a Duke basketball jersey in the student section in Keenan. I did that. I was actually really glad that Carolina won that game by 30-something points, because if not, I was gonna. The dude behind me was pretty drunk, and he was gonna punch me in the face probably. Like there's almost no doubt in my mind that he was gonna swing on me, because he was talking a lot of junk the whole night. He was bumping on me, and I was just like, okay, let's maybe not do this again. This was probably a bad idea. But on that note, let's talk about our lifelong relationships with Duke University. So for me, my grandfather, my parents are big Duke fans. I never really, I didn't like basketball, didn't care about basketball until maybe I was 6 or 7. And my grandfather had this recliner chair, and next to it, he had this kind of twine basket type thing. And he had a bunch of newspapers and books in it, and everything in that basket was a Duke basketball encyclopedia. It was 2001 Sports Illustrated after they had won the national title. Every time I went over to his house, I would just read that like it was the gospel. Like I was soaking in all that information. And then around this exact same time was, or a little bit after this, was when Duke wins the 2010 national championship. And I think that kind of cemented my undying love for Duke basketball. And from that point forward in my life, my identity was just closely linked to being an enormous Duke basketball fan. My room is decked out in memorabilia. Like I have been to Cameron Indoor Stadium, despite my age, countless times, and loved it every single time. I felt at home on campus. Just loved the university. For some reason, I think when I was younger, I had never, like really young, I never really thought about going to Duke. That thought never really got into my brain until later in high school. And, some people have asked me, they'll be like, you don't change your rooting interest when like a school rejects you and then another one accepts you. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, does it hurt a little bit? Yeah, maybe. But I think that at the end of the day, I spent 18 years pouring blood, sweat, and tears into being a Duke basketball fan. And where I went to school wasn't going to change that. Because like at the end of had I chosen to go to Davidson, I don't think I'd be wearing a Steph Curry Davidson jersey every day. I don't think that's what would have went down. And so I stayed true, and I was kind of this dude that didn't really talk about it. I didn't tell people that I was a Duke fan. When people found out, they had known me already for like a year and a half. I did a pretty good job of covering my tracks on social media. There's a big reason why I did not link my name, a couple reasons why I didn't link my name to Duke Wisdom for a long time. One is because I was a student there, and I didn't really link my name to Duke Wisdom until maybe like a half a year before I started writing at the Daily Tar Heel, oddly enough. That was one reason. The second reason is because I wanted people to take me seriously. And my concern when I was like in high school was, if people find out like I'm 15 years old, are they gonna like actually take what I say seriously? And so I came to that conclusion once I turned about 20. I was like, okay, I'm 20 now. Like I feel like people will take me seriously at this point. Or maybe I was 19. I might have been 19 actually when I linked my name to it. And I'm glad I did. And I actually wish I had done that earlier, because the relationships I've been able to build with people since I've actually connected myself to it, I love that, and that's been very much an invaluable experience. But not going to Duke hasn't put me any further from Duke. Every time I'm on campus, still I kind of get this feeling, like when I'm in Chapel Hill, I feel like this is where I went to school, and like that, and I feel a different feeling than when I'm at Duke. Like I feel it in my bones when I'm in Cameron Indoor Stadium. Like it's this special place to me, whether I spent 4 years as a student there or not. And I can't see that changing at any point in time. I love that institution. I love both institutions, but the basketball team specifically at Duke has just been this huge pillar of consistency in my life, that it has constantly been something that is important to me since I was, like 6 years old. And that's special, because how many things last that long in your life? And for me, I can say that really my love for Duke basketball has been tested, tried, and it has succeeded and saw the test of time.
I would say that my love of Duke has also stood the test of time, because it dates back so far. My father used to take us to all the games, football and basketball, until he finally got fed up with the football team. But we were going to the games, from as young as I can remember, when, there were freshman teams that were separate from the upperclassmen. I remember going down to the bleachers and getting autographs as a kid of a team that had Dick DiVinzio on it, if that gives you some idea how far back. And,
an all-time legend.
Well, I remember him. He was a lefty like me. And so, he was sort of like my role model. And, Cameron Indoor, for sure, is a special place. I've still got tickets, thanks to my late father, which I'm able to get through my stepmother as long as she remains alive. So we're going to keep her on life support if necessary so that we can continue to take advantage of that deal because he's grandfathered in at a pretty good price. But we were there during the lean years, the Bucky Waters years and all that. So we saw the hard times as well as the good times. Still have his seats to sit in. And then I was telling you earlier, a couple of my relatives actually played for Duke back in the 20s and 30s. The guy that I'm named after, C.C. Weaver, that was Charles Clinton. He was actually a three-sport letterman all 3 years at Duke in football, baseball, and basketball, and he played 26 through 28. And then my other great uncle Phil was there and played basketball 32 through 34 and was captain of the team in 1934. So the cool part of that is that their names are on the wall at Cameron, where they've got all the lettermen listed right outside Section 6, which is ironically where my father's seats are. So it's a cool thing, I was able to point it out to my daughter, and she was like, "Oh, I'm famous." So yeah, it's definitely a special place for me as well.
All right, so let's kind of do a little bit of a role play here. You're a student at Carolina, so let's go back in the day. You're a student at Carolina. Duke just won the day before. How are you feeling, and what is the energy like on campus? Are you trying to hide emotions, or what's going on through your head, and what's it look like?
Well, I kept a very low profile. It was before social media. It was before the internet. So I didn't have the same issues that you had in terms of trying to keep a low electronic profile. But I wasn't going around crowing about it. The people in my suite, they probably knew that I was a Duke fan, but I didn't. I don't think I wore Duke shirts around campus or anything like that. I wasn't going to flaunt it because you know how the rivalry is. But my whole attitude was similar to yours, that 18 years of upbringing wasn't going to be overcome by 4 years of schooling. So I went there as a Duke fan. I left there as a Duke fan, and the college experience just wasn't going to change my true colors on the inside.
I've got a couple of funny stories about, the day before, the day after type stuff of Duke and Carolina playing each other. One is in John's first year, actually. So in 2023, I was in I think, media law class, and a couple of my classmates had written like "Duke sucks" on the board. This is like, I guess it was the day before they played. They were like, "Duke sucks," and they wrote all this stuff about it. And I'm like, okay, like I'm just sitting there staying quiet. Duke wins. I think that must have been the game in Cameron, because I think it was the first one that season. And Derek Lively had that ridiculous game. I come into class on Monday, and everything's still written up there on the board, and I have the biggest smile ever on my face when I walk into that classroom, and I'm just chuckling as I sit down in my seat. Nobody asked me what I'm laughing about, but I was having a pretty good time with that. Another story. Obviously, I was there when they played in the Final Four against one another. So that was a weird week. That was a weird, horrible week, because like everybody, we were having like class conversations. Like professors were making us have like, we were having like 20-minute conversations in the middle of class about the fact that this game was happening. And so I'm just sitting there trying to hide the fact that I'm rooting against all of everyone else in that class's interest. And so like my brother, works at the university, and he and I, we got lunch together maybe like the day before, 2 days before. And we both came to the agreement that we were like, this game's going to be ridiculous. It's not going to feel real. It's going to feel like we're tripping on acid for 2 hours. But at the end of the day, he and I both came to the agreement that we were like, we both know good and well that whoever wins this game is going to lose to Kansas. And lo and behold, it ended up happening that way. Who knows what would have happened if Duke won? But that was like the lead up to it. The day, or the Monday after, I guess. I probably didn't show myself on Sunday. But the Monday after, like the day of the national championship, I walked around campus like a ghost. like it was the worst feeling ever because 20-something thousand people were so happy and I was miserable. So it was a really rough day that day. And so the highs and lows of being able to silently gloat or also be able to or have to bear a silent dread was definitely an interesting thing.
Yeah, of course, UNC has lifetime bragging rights. It's undeniable. One advantage I think of being sort of a hybrid as we are is that I think it provides some impartiality and objectivity about our views of Duke and Carolina that maybe a really rabid Duke fan or a really rabid UNC fan just would not have because they're incapable of seeing things clearly, you know. But the truth of the matter is, Carolina's got lifetime bragging rights until and unless we meet again in the Final Four and exact our vengeance. They've got lifetime bragging rights, plain and simple. So it's a bitter pill to swallow. The part that kind of galls me about that, though, is they talk about having retired Coach K. Okay, well, didn't he announce that about a year earlier?
Coach K's career would have lasted a maximum of 48 more hours.
Exactly. I believe it was going to end one way or the other. I mean, I get it. They want to crow about it for the rest of their lives, but he was going to retire. He was retired. I mean, do we go around talking about Dean Smith being retired by Arizona and the national semis because that was his last game? You don't hear the Arizona Wildcats going around talking about how they retired Dean Smith. So, a little bit of putting it in context and not blowing it so out of proportion would be helpful. But that just doesn't happen in this rivalry. Everything gets blown out of proportion.
That it does. And we're ready for another installment of things getting blown out of proportion. So with us talking about all the context and everything in the past, let's talk about the future of this rivalry. But let's contextualize the matchup on Saturday just a little bit more. Duke, currently the number 2 team in the country, playing a Carolina team struggling mightily that already has 9 losses before February. That looks like they may or may not be a tournament team. A lot of people seem to think they've already played their way out of that. I tend to disagree. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's talk about the late or the very recent history of the rivalry. In the last 4 years, Duke has lost 3 times to Carolina in Cameron Indoor Stadium. They're 1-3 in the last 4 meetings in the building. The only time they won was the one I talked about earlier, the Derek Lively game. Other than that, they got beat in 2021. No shocker there. Lost K's last game in Cameron in 22 and lost their last season. And so I think there was a good while there from like 2010 through 2017 where Duke really owned this rivalry, man. Like they big time owned this rivalry. I think there was a point from if you start with the first time they played in 2010 and you go through the first time they played in 2016 where Duke was 11-3 against Carolina. And during that span, from that point forward, Carolina definitely has the series lead on Duke. They took the series in 2018. They took it in 2019. They took it in 21 and 22 and then in last year as well. And so it's getting kind of old quick, and maybe what we need is a Duke team that is this good. To kind of end, well, maybe not end, but at least put a temporary hold on Carolina, kind of getting the best of Duke in this rivalry. I don't think that Carolina's had the better teams lately than Duke. Like I think Duke's been a better team almost every season, with a couple of exceptions like last year. But ultimately, Carolina's getting the better of them, and when they meet on the floor lately, and so I think this team, while Duke has not been playing particularly well the last 2 games, they found ways to win. They might have Malik Brown back. We'll talk more about that. But they need to pedal to the metal because I think Duke has something to prove. I don't think as a team this year they have to prove that. They're on a 14-game winning streak. You can't prove but much else. But I think in a very confined world of the Duke-Carolina rivalry, Duke's got something to prove here.
Well, they have been struggling. Carolina's coming in really, really, really needing this victory to turn things around for their season and potentially to get into the NCAA tournament. So it's huge for them, but they're sort of playing with house money, and that's always a dangerous situation when they come in with nothing to lose and everything to gain. So when things always point decidedly in one direction, that's when you really have to be on the lookout for the exact opposite happening, because that's just the way it goes in this rivalry. But on paper, sure, looks like Duke should win easily, right? So ring, 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 there goes the warning bells. Duke should win. Will they win? Another question altogether.
Yeah, you never really know. I think the biggest example of that is when they met in the Dean Dome in 2020. Oddly enough, that was actually the Carolina Duke game that my brother got his student ticket to at UNC, which is really unfortunate for him because that Carolina team was a 19 loss team. That team sucked, and Duke was like a 2 seed that season. They may have lost to Stephen F. Austin earlier in the year, but they were still a good team, a 2 seed. And on paper, Duke should win that game by 30 points. 100%. Lo and behold, they're down double digits most of the second half, and it takes perhaps the greatest miracle comeback and 2 buzzer beaters for them to win that game. So that was that really puts things into perspective. That what the paper says means very little in this matchup. But anyway, we're going to look at the matchup on paper just because. Well, it's fun to look at it that way because Duke's a lot better than Carolina right now. So let's look at that matchup. Let's look at the guard matchup first and foremost. The Tar Heels have a lot of firepower on the perimeter. There's no doubt about that. Pretty much all of their offense comes from its guards. R.J. Davis, of course, being and I'll say best player in quotations this year, because there have been a lot of moments where Ian Jackson has really given him a run for his money in that department. But, you look at R.J. Davis, Ian Jackson, Elliot Cadeau, they're strong. Now, they've struggled to shoot. I mean, Seth Trimble. I forgot Seth Trimble. Obviously, Seth Trimble as well. They've struggled to shoot from 3. That's no secret. All the Tar Heel guards, Elliot Cadeau, they talked this big game about him getting better as a three-point shooter. I haven't seen it. It kind of seems like it's the Ben Simmons type offseason argument every year where it's like, oh, yeah, he's been in the lab. He's shooting in it. That doesn't really turn out that way. R.J. Davis, on the other hand, 41% three-point shooter last year, and he's barely scratching 30 right now. So that's tough. That's really rough. They've definitely seen some of these guys, they've ebbed and flowed. They haven't been exactly consistent. But what has been consistent is that they're going to win or lose games by how many points those guards can score. And so for Duke, they're going to have to really do a really good job defensively. And I don't doubt that they can. They outsize UNC significantly on the perimeter. When you look at Davis at 5'11", Elliot Cadeau at 6 foot, and then you look at Tyrese Proctor at 6'5", and Sion James as a fullback's 6'6", and you're like, okay, they should be able to manage defensively. Elliot Cadeau really shouldn't do a ton to Sion James, but it's not always that simple. A lot of the times, the speed and being lower to the ground actually can make you more difficult to defend when you have a taller defender on you. I do think Tyrese and Sion are very capable defenders. I do not think they will outscore Carolina's backcourt. I think that is pretty much impossible. If they do, if Tyrese and Sion outscore R.J. Davis and company for UNC in the backcourt, Duke's going to win by 53. That's pretty much where it is. Duke's guards are not going to outscore Carolina's guards, no doubt about that. But their job is to try to limit them. Tyrese and Sion's main role will be a defensive one on Saturday.
Yeah, Tyrese has done pretty well, as I recall. The last few times he's met up with RJ, so I feel really good about that particular matchup. It is a game of size versus speed. 4 of their 5 starters, if you believe the measurements, which I don't. I don't believe Elliot Cadeau's 6'1". he looks maybe 5'11" to me, but 4 of their 5 guys are under 6'4" or less on the starting 5. So they're much, much shorter. We definitely have the height advantage. I like all of our matchups really across the board. And we've been pretty good defensively until the last couple of games where we've given up a lot of straight line drives, and we have suffered mostly at the hands of smaller guards who've been quick and getting by our bigger guards, getting to the basket. So that seems to be part of where the lapses happen. If we have Malik Brown back, that's going to go a long way towards stopping that in this game. And so hopefully we'll have our guy back from our knee sprain, and they won't have their guy back from their knee sprain, Jalen Washington. But there's a lot to like on the individual matchups. I'm sure that's why Ken Palm says we're going to win by 15. I don't believe that. But I am glad you brought up the 2020 game, though, because that's like my favorite Duke-UNC game of all time. I just love that
It's amazing.
game. I was watching that earlier today on YouTube. When I was a kid, Carolina came back, 8 points in 17 seconds. That was a complete heartbreaker before the 3-point shot even existed. But I almost felt okay with it after the 2020 game. It was like, it took us about 25 years, but we finally got payback. And that 2020 game is just like the best Duke Carolina game ever.
That one was a lot of fun, and it's always so cool that you can immediately recognize any picture from that game because they each wore those weird logo jerseys that have never been broken out since. But let's keep going down the matchups. I'm glad you brought up Malik Brown because I think he's going to be, if he does play, he's going to be huge against Carolina specifically because of that speed that Carolina has. And I do have my doubts about Malawach and Gongba on switches with R.J. Davis and Elliot Cadeau. I think that first step's going to be way too fast from Davis and Cadeau, and they're going to get right to the rack, and there's not a whole lot they can do about it. Malik Brown kind of helps prevent that, and he prevents Duke from having to go into his own defense like they have in the last 2 games. So Malik's huge in this one, I think. He's big in the way that Duke will guard that UNC backcourt. From an offensive standpoint for Duke, I'd love to see a good game from Knipple. I think a good game for Knipple means Duke wins on Saturday. Obviously, there's Cooper Flagg, which begs the question for Carolina, who do you put on Cooper Flagg, or maybe rather, how many guys do you put on Cooper Flagg? Because I expect there to be doubles pretty consistently there, given, like you said, Carolina has those guys that are 6'4" and under. They go with the usual starting lineup. They're going to have to go with one of those guys on Flagg, or you're going to have to go with, Drake Powell, or you're going to have to go with Van Allen Lubin, especially if Washington's not out there. But even if Washington was, or Lubin is, they need to guard Malawach. They need to guard Malik Brown. You don't really have to guard Malik all that much, but you got to at least respect him because he can give you 30. He did it last year to Duke and Carolina, and so you got to respect that. You definitely got to respect Malawach. And then, like you said, with Jalen Washington, if he doesn't play, Duke needs to feed the big man because take it to the iron, boys. They're weak inside. You know what I'm saying? Like that's a mismatch if there ever was one with Lubin. Not that Malawach has exactly been Mr. 20 or 30 points in any given game that Duke plays a small team, but I think he could really make them pay. And the quicker that Lubin gets into foul trouble, the easier it's going to be for Malawach to get going. Now, if Malik Brown doesn't play, the key for Duke is to keep Cooper Flagg and Malawach out of foul trouble and keep them on the floor for as long as possible because you don't want to give up that advantage. Now, I will say if Malik doesn't play, hypothetically, R.J. Davis, Elliot Cadeau, they're getting to the rack. They're tearing things up on switches. Malawach can't keep up with it. In that situation, you'll probably actually see John go with Mason Gillis at the 5 and just kind of sit all the big men and go for a full small ball game. And that would be an interesting thing to see Cooper Flagg be the biggest guy on the floor. Would be interesting, and I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that we'll see some of that.
Right. Definitely could have Gillis out there, especially if there's foul trouble and if Malik is limited in any way or can't go. I think my worst nightmare scenario would be if Ian Jackson decides that, he has hatred for Duke in his heart and goes off, for 25, 30 points. That's kind of been the story. The most recent losses to UNC, it was Cormac Ryan who went out of his head. And then 2 years before that, it was Brady Manick who couldn't miss from the wing. So, Ian Jackson fits that description of the guy who could go off. And I don't think it's going to be the preseason National All-American Player of the Year candidate, R.J. Davis. He has fallen back to earth, and I expect him to stay there. I think Tyrese will keep him earthbound, but it's somebody like Ian Jackson or, heaven forbid, Drake Powell, who decides, this is my one time playing Duke and Cameron, so why not, just hang my own jersey up there in the rafters.
Yeah, they could have their Trey Parker game, so to speak. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But a couple of questions here, and we talked about them a little bit earlier. But Carolina's tournament status, right? That's the big question for the Tar Heels this year. There's questions potentially over Hubert Davis's job. We've talked about that in the past. But the two big questions here. The first one, does a win for Duke on Saturday make it impossible for Carolina to make the tournament? What's your answer to that?
No, there's still a way forward. They got us again, and then they got the ACC tournament. I mean, look what happened with NC State. You never say never. There's always a way into the tournament, but I don't think it slams the door. I think they're like Dracula. Man, you can't kill these people. They keep losing games, but they're never out of the tournament. And there's a bias, I think, maybe toward putting them in the tournament, no matter how awful they are. That it's just based on their reputation, their history, and deserved. To give the benefit of the doubt to one of the blue bloods of the sport. So no, I think they still got a shot, even if they lose.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll paint a picture here. Their toughest games left on the schedule are, of course, the two matchups with Duke. But other than that, their games with Pittsburgh at home, whom they just lost to at Pitt, and then Clemson. That's literally their next two games after this one. Let's say they lose to Duke on Saturday. If they win those next two games against Pitt and Clemson, they kind of have an easy ride the rest of conference play before that last game. It's not out of the realm of possibility if they were to win those next two games that they could not lose again until they play Duke again. So even if they get swept by Duke, they win the rest of those games. What are they, like 20-11 to end the year? They'll make it. They'd make the tournament because losing to Duke at this point means nothing to your resume. It does nothing to your resume. Duke's rated that highly that if you lose to them, who cares?
You're supposed to. Right.
Yeah. But let's say on the other hand here's the other question. Does a win for Carolina put them squarely in the field?
And I would say the answer is yes. A win against Duke is that big of a deal. And in Cameron, even bigger. So, I mean, the wheels would have to seriously fall off. Like, okay, maybe they beat Duke and then lose every other game. There is a way to still not be in the tournament, I suppose. But I do think it puts them in if they win.
Yeah, I think it would be kind of difficult for them to blow it at that point. It reminds me a lot of that 2022 team. Like, it was 50-50 on whether they were going to make the tournament before they walked into Cameron for K's last game. They got that win, and there was no questions anymore. And heck, they were an 8 seed at that. It's not like they were on the edge of glory. That moved them up from the bubble being like an 11 to an 8. That moved them up like 3 seed lines, which I think is honestly what you would see if it happens. Now, I don't think it will, and that kind of comes into our ending question. But First, I want to ask, do you get more of, I mentioned that 2022 team, do you get more of a 2022 UNC vibe or a 23 vibe, the number one preseason team that missed the tournament from this team? Which is it more similar to?
Well, my daughter was in tears after that 2022 Coach K farewell, sitting there in Cameron next to me. I don't want that vibe at all. So I have to vote for the 2023 vibe. We were at that game too, and watching Jeremy Roach hit the 2 free throws that sealed it. And yes, I think Carolina's a lot closer to saying no thanks to the NIT than they are to running the tables in the NCAAs for sure.
This team reminds me, I'm gonna cheat a little bit. It reminds me a lot of the 2021 Carolina team because it's poorly constructed, although that 21 team just had big men and no guards, and this team is the complete opposite. The only difference here is that UNC, they scheduled a way tougher schedule this year and are kind of hurt because of it. Than they did in 21. And then the second difference when you look at the rivalry perspective is Duke freaking sucked in 2021. And they were a national championship contending team. And actually, they kind of gave Carolina a run for their money that year. So for me, that's why I think, and I'm going to go ahead and pose the last question to you, and I'm going to answer it when I do. Who wins and by how much? My answer is Duke by about 7.
I'm going Duke by double digits, meaning 10 or more. I don't think it's going to be 15, so somewhere in the 10 to 12 range. But we got to get them, They're down, we're up. We got to get them and get them good, especially in our place. There's so many levels of payback. Cooper Flagg was sitting there last year watching, and I hope he was taking notes about how to exact revenge because it's Cooper time.
Well, is that your answer for my final question, which is who's going to be the player of the game?
Of course, Superman. Yeah, Cooper Flagg.
Yeah, I mean, is there any doubt? I kind of get tired of making the Cooper Flagg player. I say kind of because I don't really, but get tired of making the Cooper Flagg player of the game at every single game. But it saves me the trouble of changing the name on the graphic every game. There's no doubt about that. And so I agree with you. I think that Cooper Flagg is the player of the game here. And if he's not, I think either something went horribly wrong or horribly right. Because that means that Duke just had that much of a distributed scoring effort, which would be a blowout win, or they somehow actually held Cooper Flagg to like 10, and it was just disastrous. But I do think Cooper's going to have a good game. I think he's going to etch his name into the history of this rivalry. And I think Duke's going to get a win, and let's hope that the next time we record, we're not regretting saying that.
We will see.
Yep. Only time can tell, but thank you guys so much for listening, as always. This one was a lot of fun to get to talk about our own personal complicated relationships with these two schools, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it throughout the season and especially before that second matchup with Carolina. I hope everybody enjoys watching Duke-Carolina on Saturday. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever it is you're listening. Follow Duke Wisdom on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you.